In the United States, very close to Washington, D.C. on the East Coast. I'm a Salesforce application architect. I have been an independent consultant for the last 3 years full-time. Before that, I worked at numerous for-profit and nonprofit companies, going all the way back to 2012 when I first logged into Salesforce as an accidental admin. So I've come a long way. I have 10 certifications these days and always looking to learn about Salesforce and flow, automation, reporting, and I wanted to put this session together to sort of catalog all of the tips and tricks that I've come up with for dealing with flow automation, that declarative automation. Salesforce has recently made it so that flows are the only way you can do declarative automation these days. You cannot create workflow rules anymore. Process Builder, I think you can't create new ones. You can still edit old ones, and they're targeting 2025 to fully retire those features. So everybody's talking about flows, and I wanted to really highlight some of the performance considerations for flows. There's that migrate tool, which will sort of one-to-one map everything to flow. But there's actually a lot better ways to set up your flows to accomplish all the same requirements, but have some performance impact in mind so that you can minimize that loading time when people click save on a record and you see that spinny wheel where your flows are running. We want to keep that to a minimum so that Salesforce runs fast and seems seamless for people. So I'm going to go through a number of examples and sort of highlight what I'm talking about and go through some of the use cases. But keep in mind, these are patterns that you can apply to any sort of requirement that fits sort of the same guidelines here. We're talking all about record-triggered flows today. So there are numerous kinds of flows, but we're going to focus on that record-triggered automation, which is that replacement for the workflow rules and the process builders. So these are flow logic that run when you save a record that's brand new, or you edit an existing record and click the save button. Here's our quick agenda. There's two flavors of flows. We're going to talk about before save flows that are optimized for fast field updates. What does that mean? How do we use them? I have a whole section on after save flows for all those other wonderful actions we might want to run, and then we'll have time for a quick Q&A at the end. So getting right to it, before save flows, optimized for fast field updates. What are they good at? They're really good at updating the same record that triggered the flow to run. So if somebody creates an account and you want to update another field on the account, you should be using that fast field update, a before save flow. So let's go through an example of that. In this fictitious org, there's a sales organization that wants to make their opportunity names on all their records consistent. So they want a naming convention in place. They want it to automatically include the account name, the close date of that opportunity, and the amount. Anytime they update one of those three fields, the name of the record should be updated accordingly. Now we can set that up in a record-triggered flow. And I'm going to go through this a little bit slowly for the first one, but we will speed up because we only have half an hour here. And this automation is going to run on the opportunity object. We want to configure this to run anytime a record is created or updated. I want to skip down here to the bottom where we set the before versus after save flow. So we're optimizing this flow for fast field updates because these types of flows are really good at updating the same record, and it's because they don't introduce any extra DML actions. When you work with the workflow rule and you do an update on the same record, the record gets saved, it kicks off the workflow rule, and then the record gets updated, which is 2 DML statements. It goes through that whole order of operations save process twice. This fast field updates is happening in between when you click the save button and when the record is committed to the database. So you're able to make adjustments to that record sort of on the fly in the process of the DML operation already in progress. And that's what makes them so fast and so powerful for a lot of our record-triggered automations. Once we have that set up, it sort of explains what I do here in the next step. Entry conditions are the #1 way to make sure your flows are only running when they absolutely need to. And the way that translates as you build out more and more flow automation, if you're making sure each one only runs when it absolutely needs to, you don't waste any processing time on any flows that don't need to be run for a certain scenario. So I'm very granular and very particular about setting these entry conditions on every single record triggered flow. You should probably never have them run wide open, because that means every time a record is edited or created, your flow logic runs, and it might not need to. So what do we want to do for this situation? We want to set that opportunity name anytime a brand new record is created. So how do we do that? How do we set that entry condition here? You can check the ID field to see if it has a value. Because we're running this flow optimized for fast field updates, it's happening after you click the save button, but before it's committed to the database. If that ID field doesn't have a value yet, you know it's a brand new record, because that ID field does not get set until a record is committed to the database, which happens after this flow logic is evaluated. So that's the first check here. I'm using OR conditions, so I can check for 3 other situations where I would want to update the name of the opportunity record. Has the account changed? Somebody update that lookup field. Has the amount changed, or has the close date changed? Now, if any of those 4 things are true, I want to go ahead and run this flow logic. So for the rest of the flow, there's only one element on the canvas. We have this update records element. Now, it's called update records, but Salesforce has locked this down. They're trying to make it simple for people who might not be familiar with the order of operations. The only thing you can do in this update records in a before save flow is assign values to the record that triggered the flow. This behaves identical to if you used an assignment element on this canvas in a before save flow. But I think what Salesforce was trying to do is make it clear the values you assign to the record are going to get committed to the database. So they've introduced this locked down version of the update records element. There's no extra DML being introduced here. So you're very safe to use this. You could also use the assignment element, that yellow element, if you wanted to, or you have older flows that do that. Now, I've set my entry conditions very specifically, so I don't need to further filter when this element runs or not. So I'm going to go ahead and skip that part and just assign a value to the field I want to update, and that's the name field. And I use a lot of formula resources. So you see this name value formula resource. We'll find that over here in the formulas, and this gives you a lot of flexibility to use any kind of logic you might want to have for setting that name value. You have access to all the functions you're used to from creating formula fields on an object. You can reference values from the triggering record. That's this $record global variable. And you have all of those without performing any queries. So if I wanted to get any value from the opportunity, I have access to it right here. No extra queries are introduced. Now, what do I end up doing for the logic of this name convention? I want to talk through a couple things here. This first step is assigning the name of the account as that first element in our name for the opportunity. Now, we need to traverse a relationship field in order to get access to that account name. I got to go through that account ID relationship on the opportunity up to the account, grab that name, and put it in. Now, what I like to encourage people to do is make sure you check that the relationship you're traversing has a value before you attempt to go get a value from a parent record or a grandparent record. If you don't do that, you might run into errors at runtime where Flow will say, I couldn't access that value. That's because it was a blank lookup field is what's happening there. So what I do here is I check to make sure that an account is specified. If so, then I can safely traverse that account relationship and grab the name value from that account record. This works for all levels. If you're going up 3 or 4 levels, which you can do from that $record global variable, just make sure each one of your relationship fields has a value before you attempt to traverse it, and you'll be safe to do that. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is we have to be very mindful of our data types. So I'm pulling in the close date field, which is a date data type, but I want to put it into a text field. So I just need to convert it here, wrapping it in a text function. Same is true for the amount field. That's currency, so we need to translate that into text, but we also want to apply the same formatting that we're used to in whatever currency you want to display. That could be dynamic. You might have multiple currencies. When Salesforce stores a currency value in the database, it's just a number, and it may or may not have a decimal point and decimal places. So if you want to format a currency field to look a certain way, you kind of have to do that formatting yourself. And what I wanted to highlight here is that we have access to all of the functions and formulas from a formula field on a custom object. So you can look up the syntax and a similar formula for whatever currency you're working with. I got this from the success community and tweaked it for my needs. And this is just adding in the commas, the decimal place, and making sure I'm having 2 decimal places for the cents. And that's really it for our flow. So very simple, starting with the basics here. I'm going to go ahead and activate this so that we can do a quick test and make sure it works. So I've activated my flow. I'm going to go over here to an account record. I'm going to create a brand new opportunity. I'll put in an amount, 6,000. I'll put a close date for the end of the month, and I'll set a stage. Now watch what happens to my opportunity name field. As soon as I click save, my flow logic runs, and because I'm applying that naming convention before the record's committed to the database, even my toast message already has the name that I've set up here. So you see how those different values get pulled into that name field. And if I were to update one of these values that's referenced in the name field, maybe I'll set this to $90,000. As soon as I hit save, my entry conditions say, hey, that amount field changed. I need to go update that opportunity naming convention. Now, we have 2 different options here that I want to point out. If I leave my flow configured as is, somebody could come in here and make an adjustment at the end, and their edits would be saved along with the record there. You could either leave that as is if you want to allow for an override like that, or you could adjust your entry conditions to basically have a standard field, like the name field, behave like a formula, so nobody can make edits to it. All we would have to do for that is add one more entry condition to check to see if the name field is changed. And you can essentially say, you're not allowed to change that field. I'm going to set it to the value that I have set up in the flow logic here. So that's a variation on this. If you want to use this for any other same record field updates and you want them to behave like a formula, very useful for the name of a record, very useful if you want to have a pick list for the reporting functionality that comes along with selecting values. You can have your pick list behave like a formula and not allow edits to it. So you set it all using logic, which is pretty cool. Lots of other use cases. I want to go through one other quick example just to show how we get a little bit more complicated in our requirements and how we can make sure we're doing that in the most performant way. So in this example, we want to do a conditional update and we need a query. So this fictitious sales org, they want to help out their delivery team and consolidate a lot of their shipments. So sales team is constantly creating new opportunities, which is great because they're all independent deals, but they want to ship them all out at the same time. So the way they're going to facilitate that is whenever the sales team creates an opportunity, we need to go check to see if that account has other open opportunities. So we can sort of link them together and say like, hey, let's put all the shipments on one of them. So they want to check to see if there's any other open opportunities, and then if one exists, they want to put a link to that record so the salesperson can go right to it. Now we're going to store that in the next step field on the opportunity. What I want to highlight with this example is a couple things. We're going to introduce a query here because we need to do that check to see if the parent account has any other open opportunities. That's not something we can get access to by traversing fields on the $record global variable. We actually need to put a query in our before save flow so we can go find that information. Now let's start from the top here. My entry conditions, have they changed? In this case, no. Because I'm already running this flow when a brand new opportunity is created, ID is null equals true. That is the scenario where I want to do this check, so I don't actually need to make any updates here. What I'm going to do, though, is route to a decision element. I like to protect my queries, A, because they apply towards limits, B, they take a little bit of time to run. So I want to make sure in this before save flow that I only execute that query when absolutely needed. And I use a decision element to do that. So a lot of times you'll see people use decisions for the business logic. I use it more for flow performance. And I handle the business logic in other ways, which I'll show you in a second. So the decisions are really just about routing to the proper elements on your flow canvas from a performance standpoint. So in this decision, I check, do I need to go find an open opportunity on the account? And the way I put in that criteria, if I find that I'm going to be reusing that criteria in multiple places in my flow, I store it in a formula resource. That way I have one place to maintain that logic, and I can reference it throughout my flow. So I'll reference it here in the decision. I might reference it later in the assignment. So I check, and the way I'm doing that is a formula resource can have different data types. So the one I'm using here is a Boolean, which means it resolves to true or false. So in this formula, I'm saying, is this a brand new record? You can use the isNew function once you're in your flow and you're using a formula resource. And then you want to do things like make sure you have all the information you need in order to run a query. So we only want to run this for new records that specify an account, because we're going to go find open opportunities on that account. So if both of those things are true, I'm going to go down the left side of this decision outcome, and I'm going to go to this get open opportunity query. It's a get records element. What's happening here is I'm searching for that next open opportunity. So find me an opportunity record where the account ID is the same account on the record that triggered the flow. I want to make sure it's open, so I set is closed equals to false. I'm going to sort those records ascending by close date. I want to find the very next open opportunity on that same account. And here's where things get interesting. You have the option to automatically store all fields, and that'll put it in a record variable. That can be useful a lot of times. But what I find is if you store it in a record variable, you have to use a decision element to figure out if your query found results or not. And that's an extra element that has to be processed, and you have to deal with all the outcomes for that. So I find that if you only need a very specific piece of information, like in this case, we just need the ID of that record. We don't need to store it in a record variable. I can actually take what I need and store it in plain variables in the flow. What's nice about variables is you don't need to use a decision to check if they have a value or not. They won't fail the same way that checking a record variable would fail if you just attempted to grab a value from it. So what I do here is I say I'm going to assign variables, this advanced option, and take my ID from the record I found and put it in a variable called open opportunity ID. It's a plain text variable, and we can reference it safely throughout the rest of our flow without having to use a decision element to check to see if it has a value or not. Now, regardless if I execute that query or I skip it, I'm going to route to a single update records element at the end of my before save flow. This is one of the areas where there's a lot of debate about multiple flows or one flow. I have a theory that I've been testing to a lot of success over the last couple years that I like to organize my flows based on the action that they're executing. For all of my requirements that involve updating a field on the record that triggered a flow, I use one before save flow for that object. And it's because of what's happening when you update like 200 opportunities and your flow gets executed 200 times. If you have separate elements or separate flows, it takes a lot longer to process all of that same logic. So I found a way to consolidate and just have a single before save flow that will independently update the fields you need to update using all of your business logic, which ends up getting stored in formula resources. So you notice here, my naming convention is still intact. It's still going to work exactly the same as before, but I can add in other fields that I want to assign values to and then determine if I'm going to update its value or leave it alone. And this is where things get really fun. So this next step value is just another formula over here that now has access to everything we've done so far, and this is where our business logic is really being implemented. So I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see what's happening here. It's actually not that complex. So the whole trick behind all of this is a very simple if statement. If I need to update this field, go ahead and carry out the automation I want to execute. If not, I want to leave that field alone. And this might trip people up the first time you see it, but the way I say leave this field alone is I set it equal to the value that it already has. Because this is running in before save context, if you assign a field the value it already has, no update is made at all. It doesn't show up in field history tracking. Nothing ever happened. So it's a really nifty way to keep your logic in these formula resources and conditionally decide if you're going to update the field or not based on whatever criteria you want. So let's get into that part. So this if statement opens up with some criteria. Here's where I'm referencing that same Boolean formula that I set up earlier so I could reference it in multiple places. So if I needed to check for that open opportunity and I found a record, here's where I can safely reference that text variable where I'm storing that opportunity ID instead of using a record variable. I can always reference this right here in the formula, no extra decision elements needed. The true outcome here is to update the value in that next step field. So I have some static text, check if the products can be delivered, and then they wanted a link to the record. And I wanted to highlight this because a lot of people find this very useful. You can dynamically generate the base URL for any record in Salesforce without having to hard code that base URL. The way you do that is there's this API global resource that just gives you a server URL. There's a bunch in here because they put a new one for every different API version. So there's 3 releases a year, you'll get 3 new of these server URLs. So if you go down, you'll find there's an enterprise server URL version 59 we're up to now. If I can find the 5s. There it is. So 590 just means 59.0 for that API version. I have not noticed any difference. I would just use the latest one, and I haven't had a problem with that. All we do with that is we say, give me that enterprise server URL, everything up to and including the .com/. So I'm using a find function here in order to find that base URL. Once I have that base URL, I just tack on a record ID. So if you format your URLs like that, it's a great dynamic way to generate URLs. This also works if you're sending an email from a flow and you need to put a fully qualified URL. This is a great way to do that, and you can migrate this from sandbox to production and you won't have to make any changes here. You could take this same formula and put it in anybody's organization and it will generate that URL dynamically. So let's activate this version, and I want to show how both of our requirements can be achieved at the same time here. So again, this is just an update to that same before save flow. And if I go back over here to my opportunity, I can make an edit here. Maybe I'll change this to 80,000. Hit save. My naming convention is still making that update. If I go back to Burlington Textiles and I create a brand new opportunity entirely, this is going to, have that new logic where I'm checking to see if there's any other open opportunities. I'll set a stage and watch this next step field. So right now it's blank. Once I hit save, I'll go to that new record. My naming convention got applied, so our first requirement is still being met. And here's that check that went and found another open opportunity on the same account, put in that text along with that dynamically generated URL for this crazy sandbox that I'm in. It's a Trailhead playground. So that's a lot of things I'm throwing at you, but what I'm getting at here is your flows, your before save flows that are just updating the same record, maybe other fields. This is about as complex as your canvas should look. You're going to have maybe a few decisions if you need to run a couple queries. So you might add in elements 2 and 3 a couple more times for other things you might need to grab. But at the end of this, you really want to consolidate all of your assignments into one update records element, which is assigning values to the record. When you bulk update 200 or 1,000 or 10,000 opportunity records, all of those assignments get bulkified if you keep them in that single element versus having it in separate elements or separate flows entirely. Then it would have to loop through all of your records that many more times. So this I've found is the most efficient way you can do these before save flows. Now let's switch gear. Oh, so this is a recap of everything we talked about for before save flows. I have a QR code at the end if you want access to these slides. We're going to protect our decisions, query only when we need to, store things in regular variables when you can, and then I'm heavy use of formula resources to conditionally set fields and allows you to reuse your logic. Now let's talk about after save flows. So the big difference here, our fast field updates is updating the same record. Our actions and related records is doing everything else. So any kind of automation that's not updating the same record, you're going to do in actions and related records. That'll be updating a different record, creating another record, sending an email, all of those other things. Our first example here is creating multiple records. So in the fictitious sales org, if an account's customer priority is changed to high, which is something a sales manager might do, they want to create 2 tasks for that sales rep who owns the account. They want them to review the account today and then call the client tomorrow. So one action is occurring on an account record, 2 tasks need to be created. How do we set that up in a flow? Here's our account after save flow. This is running on the account object. I only need this to run when a record is updated. That's the only time this should kick off. And then I have my entry conditions set to make sure that customer priority equals high. And then down here, I say only run this when the record's updated to meet those conditions. Again, be very specific about when your flows run. This is set up for actions and related records so that we can update other records besides the one that triggered the flow. Here's the whole canvas. So it might seem like there's not enough going on here, but a lot of the magic is happening in this single assignment element. Salesforce recently put in their documentation that these assignments are guaranteed to execute in the order you specify them here, which is huge because it means you no longer have to do separate ones to make sure things happen in a specified order. You can just make sure they're ordered in the order you want them here. So what I'm doing is I'm going to be working with record variables and also collections in order to satisfy this. I've set up 2 record variables which will store all the values I want for the 2 task records I'm creating. So here's task 1 and task 2. They're exactly the same. They're record data types. You choose the object, in this case, task. Now, in order to assign values to a task, you use an assignment element. And in here, I can assign all those values, who it's assigned to, the due date, the subject, meeting all the requirements here. And then right behind it, I can do task number 2 in the same assignment element. So I assign all the values for that task. And then at the end here, I'm adding my tasks to a record collection. Now the metaphor I like to use here is like when you're doing laundry. Do you take your laundry out of the dryer or off of the clothes hanging rack and then fold it, go back to your room, open your dresser, put that one item in, then go all the way back to where your laundry is done and do the next item? No, that would be hugely inefficient. What do you do instead? You use a laundry basket. So these record collection variables are your laundry basket so that you can process all of your laundry, each one of your tasks, and put them in that laundry basket, aka that record collection variable. Then you do the expensive thing one time. You walk upstairs, back home, wherever you're going to get back to your dresser in your room in order to commit those changes to your database, aka your dresser. So our laundry basket record collection variable helps us gather up all of our tasks we're about to create so that we can take action on them one time. So the way you put clothes in your laundry basket is by adding that record variable, the single one, you add it to the collection. Once we have those tasks defined with their values added to the collection, we can create the task using this create tasks element, just setting up this create multiple records, and it has you choose a record collection to do that. I want to get through the final example here because we're running out of time. So let's go through the final one. The last example is updating multiple records. So in this org, if an account's active field is set to no, they want to change the stage of all the open opportunities to close lost. This is really a big time saver for the sales reps. When an account goes inactive, they used to have to go manually update each one of those. They wanted some automation to help them out. So we can do that in our flow. And this one's really underwhelming because there's only one element on our canvas. But I really want to emphasize what's happening in that element. So this is, again, set up on the account object. You might notice I'm using a separate flow for this. So while I said have one before save flow per object, I do believe that it's more efficient to have multiple after save flows, each one focused on the action that they're executing in order to consolidate your DML statements, your queries, and all the other processing that's happening. AKA, if I was doing any other requirement that involved updating opportunities when an account record is changed, I would put that in this flow called account after save update opportunities. If I had any other requirement about creating tasks when an account is saved, I would go back to my flow from before and add that logic here, just to get the benefit of using the collection to insert the records one time. So in this example, an account is updated, active equals no, I only run it when I need to, actions and related records. The element here is an update records element. And I think there's either lack of consideration or people don't quite understand what each of these four options do. So I really want to point out that if you use this fourth option, it actually does a ton of things for you. And it always does these things, is the other thing I want to cement in your minds. When you specify conditions, a query is going to be executed. So it will do a get records for you. It's going to loop through the collection of records if it found any. It's going to assign new values to those fields, and then it's going to commit those changes to the database. It's like 4 steps in one, and it all happens when you choose this fourth option. What I've seen people do is they specify conditions and they say update these opportunities that equal this ID that they already have access to. If that's the case, you don't need to specify conditions. You can actually eliminate that query that's happening there by just assigning the ID to a record variable and then updating it. So you can pick apart those 4 actions that are occurring when you use this option and just simplify it to update the records that are set in a record variable, if that makes sense. Oh, this new thing it's saving all the time now, so that kind of throws me off. Let's get back to this. So, in this case, I do want to take advantage of the fact that this update records element has the capability of consolidating all those actions, so I don't have to do the loop on my own. I'm going to update opportunities that are related to the account and are open, and all I'm going to do is set the stage name to closed lost. You have a lot of other options to split this apart and start to loop through your records and make decisions if you need to specify different outcomes, different stage names. As I mentioned, you can also eliminate that query if you need to by using one of these other options. So here's everything we talked about for after save flows. I do believe in focusing each after save flow on the action that it executes and really be mindful of consolidating your assignments and consolidating your database operations so that you're doing all the things you need to do in the minimal amount of operations possible. You should have very small flow canvases in a lot of these use cases and really be mindful of the performance impact you have when you add other things to the canvas there. Here's the QR code for the slide deck if you'd like to scan that and get access to this. And we have maybe a minute or two for questions if you have any questions. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your attention today. What questions do you have? you're looking for changes on the record that should kick off the flow, and then you really handle your business logic within the formula resources inside of your flow. So yes, you do have to add a lot to the entry conditions, but I think it ends up being worth it because of the performance benefits you get from consolidating that. Thank you so much. We're out of time, but thanks for being here. Come find me if you have other questions.